If dopamine is the pleasure chemical, why do people keep eating even when they don't enjoy the food anymore? For decades, scientists believed dopamine was the source of pleasure, the chemical that makes food taste good. But then something strange happened in a neuroscience lab. Rats with no dopamine still enjoyed sugar. Rats with extra dopamine ate compulsively while hating every bite. So if you ever thought, I don't even taste this anymore, why can't I stop? Why do I keep eating? This video will change how you understand cravings, binge eating, and self-control. Because dopamine isn't pleasure, it's something more dangerous. So in the mid-20th century, scientists mapped out the dopamine region in the brain. And then they made lesions in that region of the brain of rats, which means they killed the responsible neurons and left the others intact. As expected, because dopamine is the pleasure chemical, the rats lost their curious nature and didn't even want to eat or drink. On the contrary, when dopamine was increased by the usual popular drugs, people got high. So all this evidence showed that dopamine equals pleasure, right? But then in 1985, a young neuroscientist, Kent Berridge, set out to learn more about this chemical. He actually studied the facial expression of rats. When they like food, they stick their tongue out and lick their paws, similarly to babies and mammals. And then when they don't like it, they shake their heads and open their mouths in a kind of gape. And it had long been thought that it was an automatic reaction, it was a reflex. But Barrett showed that it was a sign of pleasure. Because if he starved these rats and then gave them sugar water, the rats had a heightened pleasure response, stick their tongue out and lick their paws. And when they filled up on sugar water, they didn't like it anymore, then they would open their mouth in a gape. And they thought that this was all driven by dopamine. But for further evidence, they designed another experiment. In this one, they gave dopamine blocking drugs to these rats. They expected, obviously, that they were not like the sugar water that they squirted into their mouths, because dopamine wasn't playing a role in this case anymore, right? But the experiment had a very surprising results. The rats happily licked their paws and stuck their tongue out. So Barry thought that he made a mistake, but after repeating the experiment, he got the same results. The sugar water remained delicious even when the dopamine was blocked. He thought that maybe the dopamine blocker wasn't strong enough, so they, with some colleagues, chemically destroyed the dopamine pathways in the rats. The rats, after this, became so uninterested in everything, including eating, that they had to be fed through a feeding tube. But still, when they squirted sugar water into their mouth, they presented the signal of pleasure. But how and why? How is this possible? If dopamine is responsible for pleasure and they took that away from them, from these rats, how could they still experience pleasure? And if eating was pleasurable for them, why did they have to be fed through a feeding tube? It didn't make any sense, right? So he changed tactics. Instead of removing dopamine, he cranked it up by sticking electrodes into the responsible brain region. But things got even more confusing. Now the rats had a huge appetite. They ate 3-4 times more than usual, but they didn't enjoy the food anymore. After a while, they started to show the signs of dislike, opening their mouth in a gape, but still kept stuffing their little faces in a way that implies that I hate this, but I can't stop eating. And it was difficult time for Berridge because all the other scientists were convinced that dopamine equals pleasure, and he went against this, right? But evidence is evidence, and later more evidence showed up. For example, people with Parkinson's disease was treated with dopamine boosting drugs. They started to do all kinds of strange things. For example, an accountant dismantled his fridge. Doesn't make sense, right? Others became addicted to shopping, gambling, sex, taking drugs. But the interesting thing is that they actually did not enjoy these activities. They were like the rats, hating the sugar, but still gorging on it. These dopamine-driven activities never actually delivered pleasure. And if you binge eat, you're probably very familiar with this feeling. After a while, you don't even taste the food, right? You can't stop eating. After a decade, Berridge finally solved this mystery. He discovered that pleasure wasn't just one thing, it was two. There are two regions of the brain that are responsible for pleasure, and they are separated from each other, but they are also connected. The first region, the green, it's like a missile tracking system. It becomes aware of the target, it tracks it, and it goes after it. When this region is cranked up with either drugs or electrodes, rats and people find their target extremely desirable and they are willing to work really hard to get it. And when this region is deactivated, life becomes dull and there is zero motivation to seek pleasure. This region is the dopamine region. Dopamine is motivation, desire, excitement, incentive. It's craving, but it's a deep and visceral desire. It's separate from rational thoughts. Berridge calls it wanting. But not all desire is wanting. For example, a desire for world peace is not wanting. That's not a dopamine thing. But desiring a glass of water after a run on a hot day is wanting. It's a dopamine thing. And it's also possible to want something that the conscious mind does not desire, like drugs or smoking. Even though you don't enjoy it, smoking is not really enjoyable, right? First time even makes people feel sick and nauseous. And after a while, drug addicts don't enjoy the drug, they just want it. And same with binge eating, right? People just eat. After a while, they don't enjoy it. But dopamine is not liking. That's the second part of the pleasure region of the brain, the red areas. Liking is the enjoyment, the payoff. It's when the sugar hits the rat's mouth. Or if you think about like a dinner or this donut on this picture, the dopamine is smelling, seeing, desiring this donut, and the liking is when you put it into your mouth and you actually taste the taste of it, right? And this liking is not dopamine. It comes from the smaller hedonic hotspots, specific tiny regions where certain chemicals like opioids make taste feel good. These pleasure centers are separate from the dopamine-driven circuits. Now the rat experiments make sense. When the rats' dopamine was blocked, they didn't want the sugar, but they still liked it because only the dopamine regions were blocked. The liking regions not. And when dopamine was cranked up, it increased the wanting, even though after a while, when you had enough, you don't like it anymore, so they didn't like it. Another piece of evidence that wanting and liking aren't the same is that sometimes we want something, and when we get it, we don't like it, sadly. But the difference between the two mental states can be a little bit blurred. Because as you can see, the liking region is inside the dopamine region and they communicate with each other. And for example, you can only you just see the cake, but you can almost taste it. You can almost like it, right? And then you taste it, you like it, and you want another bite. It's because, as I said, this liking region is embedded inside the wanting region, and they constantly communicate with each other. Liking send messages to wanting, and when we like something, we want it. And also, for example, if you get food poisoning from a food, then you don't want it anymore. You don't like it anymore, and you also don't want it anymore. But this system doesn't always work properly. This led Berridge to study addictions when pleasure has gone wrong. In the mid 1990s, there were two competing theories about addiction. According to the negative reinforcement theory, drug addicts wanted to take drugs to take away the pain of the withdrawal, so removing the negative. But there are antidepressant drugs that has withdrawal pain, but they are still not addictive. And also, addicts can be clear for many years and don't have any withdrawal pains anymore and still relapse, sadly. So this does not 100% explain addiction, right? The second theory is the positive reinforcement theory. According to this, drug addicts take drugs because the euphoria that they feel is so irresistible. But the thing is, most addicts don't even feel the euphoria anymore. They only felt it at the beginning, and they just want to have the drug again to feel that euphoria, but they don't feel it anymore. So, to study addictions, Berridge and his co-investigator Terry Robinson found that addiction is actually craving. Addiction isn't actually too much liking, that you like the euphoria too much. It's actually too much wanting. It's like a temptation overload, right? It's not the high that get an addicted, but the desire to get high, even though the drug doesn't deliver it anymore. At this point, Berridge didn't think that this had anything to do with obesity because drugs can sensitize the brain and food can't. But after reading some papers about obesity, he changed his mind. But before I tell you what he found, I want to quickly let you know that I have a group coaching program starting in March called Outgrown. And I will help the participants outgrow the version of themselves that needed food to cope, and I help them become a normal eater. I've been teaching this to my private clients for 3 years, and they had very good results. And this is going to be my first group cohort. So I would like to invite you into this group. And so if you are interested, check out the link in the description. So let's go back to binge eaters. Binge eaters crave food even when they are not hungry, right? We know very well, right? Because we binged. Well, I used to, and maybe you still do. Otherwise, you wouldn't watch this video, right? Before eating, you would overcome with this very strong anticipation of the food. We go shopping, buy the food, and imagine having the food, and we are really looking forward to eating the food, right? This is a clear sign of wrapped up dopamine that I talked about, right? And there were also studies about obese adolescent girls. In these studies, they showed pictures of milkshake to these girls. And when they saw the picture, their dopamine spiked, their wanting got cranked up, even though they didn't really enjoy the milkshake. There was too much wanting and not much liking. And this sounds pretty much like the addictions I described earlier, right? And another experiment showed that too much wanting can actually predict weight gain. So the cravings came before weight gain. In this study, scientists showed 3 images to students. girls. One was a lighthouse, the second one was a stack of pancakes covered with syrup, and the third one was a naked couple having sex. And the girls who had the biggest spike in wanting, dopamine, they gained more weight in the future than others. This research shows that obese people are not driven by an overindulgence of pleasure. They are driven by the desire, the wanting of that pleasure, like drug addicts. So obese people are not gluttonous pleasure seekers. They have a critical dysfunction between the two brain regions, wanting and liking. They experience a raging desire for food, followed by an underwhelming amount of pleasure from it. So now the question arises, what could cause this dysfunction? What revs up the wanting circuit? I tell you about it in my next video. See you soon.